Well, hello xenographers everywhere and welcome to another episode. Shooting vintage lenses on mirrorless cameras has become a real big part of modern digital photography. Vintage lenses have flaws and imperfections that modern lenses just don't, and because of those flaws and imperfections, they can make some really wild and beautiful images. If you're diving into this world for the first time, it can be a little daunting. So today I'm going to give you my 7 best tips for shooting vintage lenses like these on mirrorless digital cameras. So perhaps you've not yet bought your mirrorless camera and you're casting around to see which one might suit you best. I would always recommend a full frame mirrorless camera, and the reason for that is that most vintage lenses were designed for use with 35mm film, and full frame cameras have a sensor that's the same size as a piece of 35mm film. So they work as designed. The focal lengths stay the same, everything about them stays the same. If you use an APS-C camera or a micro four thirds camera, both of those cameras have smaller than full frame sensors. Therefore, there will be a crop factor. So if you mount, for example, a 50mm lens on a full frame digital camera, then that lens will perform according to its specification. However, if you use a smaller sensor camera, say a micro four thirds camera, and put that same 50mm lens on it, it behaves as though it were a 100mm lens. And the minimum focus distance of any given lens on a smaller sensor body is actually effectively decreased. It sounds like magic, but it isn't. So remember the crop factor. These lenses will perform differently according to the sensor size of the camera. I would suggest focus peaking is essential on any digital mirrorless camera, especially if your eyesight isn't quite as good as it was some years ago, which is the case with me. I find that with a digital mirrorless camera, it's really difficult to focus if you don't have peaking. So let's assume you've got your shiny new camera and you've got a couple of old lenses to play around with. You're going to need to adapt those lenses to your camera. They won't fit straight on there, so you'll need an adapter. There are a number of different kinds of adapter. I only ever use the so-called dumb adapters like this one here. This is the Carl Zeiss Jenner Flectagon 35mm. It's an M42 lens and it's got the M42 to, in this case, micro four thirds adapter on the back of it. So to adapt your lens, it's really simple. Here's the adapter. So to adapt your lens, just screw it onto the adapter. It doesn't have to be very tight, but make sure it's not loose. And then line up the appropriate marks. There's the dot on the adapter and there's the dot on the GH2 lens mount. So we put those two together. And there is our adapted lens. So we've now got a vintage lens on a mirrorless camera. There are a number of other types of adapter that you can use. There are adapters with, for example, a built-in focus chip so that you get a little beep when you're in perfect focus. There are even adapters with autofocus, but they tend to be rather expensive. Now remember that crop factor. Well, there is an adapter you can get that will deal with some of the problems that come from mounting a vintage lens made for 35mm on a smaller sensor camera. Those are known as focal reducers. So what a focal reducer is simply an adapter with an extra lens element in it. So imagine we've got our adapter here, and so what you would find on a focal reducer is an extra glass element within the adapter, and that compresses the image and allows you to get more of it actually onto the sensor, because if you remember, the crop factor means that you don't quite get as much of the image on the sensor as you do with a full frame camera. So a focal reducer goes some way towards curing that and towards giving you back something near the true focal length of the lens. I've never used a focal reducer on Micro Four Thirds bodies. I tend to just mount the lenses straight onto the body and shoot. I've had some very good results with old Russian 50mm. I've used the Jupiter 8 on the camera quite a lot. It does become effectively a 100mm focal length lens on Micro Four Thirds, but actually I'm fine with that because I really like the 100mm focal length. You may not, I don't know, so I guess it's your choice. So when you're buying your first vintage lens, my gosh, that is a daunting prospect. There are just so many out there. So which one should you buy? Well, you may think that expensive must be better than cheap, right? Well, no, it's not necessarily so. There are some fantastic, really cheap vintage lenses that you can get started with. There is, for example, the Jupiter 8. Lovely little lens from Russia. There's the Helios 44, another really fantastic lens from Russia. This is based on the Zeiss Biotar design, so it gives you the swirly bokeh effect. I have two Pentax lenses, a 1.8 and a 1.4, the super multi-coated Takamar versions. The 1.4 is said to be a very, very fine lens indeed, and it gets lots of rave reviews online, but actually I prefer the 1.8. I think it's rather nicer. So expensive is not always best. There are lots of budget lenses from Pentax, from Olympus, from Canon, from all the major manufacturers, as well as the old Russian lenses. And there are some really great lens bargains out there for under £40. There's the Olympus f1.8, for example. There's the Canon FD 1.8. There are the Pentax 1.8s. There are the Ricoh 1.8s and 1.7s. The Chinon, a really cheap lens, the Chinon 1.9 is a really, really nice lens. So even at the cheap end of the market, you're absolutely spoilt for choice. So my advice is start with a cheap 50mm vintage lens and get to know vintage lenses before you splash out too much cash. After all, you might not like them. Now, vintage lenses are of course old and they've picked up more than likely one or two faults along the way. The main faults you'll find with lenses are fungus, internal mold and fungus. That's quite a nasty thing. It will reduce the quality of your images, and it will also destroy your coatings on your lens and even on the glass of your lens. It will actually eat into the glass. So be very careful. Don't buy a lens that has fungus. Another fault that you often get is oil on the aperture blades. And if you close down your lens as far as it will go and you look through it, you can see the oil. It's just a shiny sort of film on the blades. Now, why is that a bad thing? You might think, well, any metal moving parts should be lubricated and that's actually good for a lens. Well, in a sense it is, but it's also bad because oil is shiny and it can make internal reflections. Also, if there's oil got onto the blades, then it might well over time seep onto the glass, and that really will degrade your image quality. So avoid a lens with an oily aperture. Other faults that lenses can pick up, well, very often the focus ring is not particularly easy to turn. This one's nice and easy because I greased it. but very often grease has dried and the focus mechanism is very tight and very stiff. Again, unless you're used to lens servicing, don't buy a lens with a stiff focus ring, because it really does degrade the experience rather of actually using the lens. Aperture rings can be a little sticky and tricky to turn, but worse than that, the actual aperture mechanism itself within the lens can seize up. There again, don't buy a lens with that fault, because you can't really use such a lens reliably. The only fault that it's really permissible to accept in a vintage lens is a few specks of dust. All vintage lenses will have a few specks of dust inside them. It won't degrade your image quality. A lot will, of course, a lot of dust, that will degrade image quality, but a few small specks, nothing to worry about at all. Vintage lenses don't have any image stabilization systems. They're simply a metal tube with some glass inside it and a focus ring and an aperture ring. So what that means is that if your shutter speed goes below a certain point, you're going to get camera shake. If your camera has IBIS, that is in-body image stabilization, that will save the day and that will stabilize your vintage lens for you. If your camera doesn't have IBIS, in-body image stabilization, well, there's a simple formula for finding the lowest shutter speed you should shoot at. This lens is a 50mm lens. So if I'm using a camera without IBIS and I mount this lens on it, the lowest shutter speed I should use to avoid any camera shake is the same figure as the camera's focal length. So this is a 50mm lens, and you should use no less than 1/50th of a second when you're shooting it. A 135mm lens, use no less than 1/135th of a second while you're shooting it. A 35mm lens, use no less than 1/35th of a second while you're shooting it, and so on. Now, if we look at the mounting of this camera, we'll see that around the circumference, the lower part of the circumference here, we've got some electrical contacts. And those are for a modern electronic lens, electronically controlled lens, to communicate with the camera. And the camera then knows there's a lens on the camera and it will do its work. If you put a vintage lens on this camera, there are no electrical contacts on this adapter. This is a simple dumb adapter. And if I put it on this camera and then try and shoot, nothing happens. The camera won't shoot. If you find yourself in this position where you've put a vintage lens on your camera but it just won't shoot and it just won't do anything, go into the settings, go into the menu. There will be a setting labeled something like shoot without lens. That's what it is on this little GH2. And what it does is it tells the camera, look, you don't have a lens mounted, but shoot anyway. The camera thinks there's no lens mounted at all because it's not getting any feedback from the lens. However, it does allow the camera to shoot, and that's how you need to set up your camera to shoot vintage lenses, because they don't give any feedback and you'll confuse your camera. So set to shoot without lens or something similar. Mirrorless cameras usually have a mode dial on the GH2. It's this one here just to the right of the viewfinder, and it's got lots of different modes on it. We've got, what have we got? We've got MPAS, we've got intelligent auto, we've got various auto settings. The only two modes that will work when you're using a vintage lens are the fully manual mode and the aperture priority mode. I use aperture priority. It's nice and easy. You simply set your aperture on the lens and the camera will select the right shutter speed. If the shutter speed is too low for the aperture you've set, increase your ISO, dive into your ISO settings and bring that up a little, and that will raise your shutter speed for you. So there we are, those are my 7 best tips for shooting vintage lenses on digital mirrorless cameras. I hope this episode's been enjoyable, I hope it's been of some usefulness. And that's it from me for now. Please don't forget to like, subscribe and ring that bell before you go. And if you like the content on this channel and you'd like to support it and help it grow and develop, you can do that at patreon.com/Zenography. As ever, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time for some more Zenography.